Chad, Versamatic. Today we're going to install an airing kit into our E1 poly with a metal center pump. Out front we have genuine Versamatic parts in the form of a wet end kit and an airing kit. The rebuild you're going to see is accurate man method machine, but for video purposes, some parts of the work performed have been condensed in time. At any point during the presentation, please pause this video until you have completed any part of the process. Identifying which kit is required for your repair has become easier on newer pumps with the permanently affixed metal serial number tag that now indicates the wet end and airing kit information for the pump. Kit information can also be found in the service and operating manual. Versamatic genuine replacement parts, wet end and airing kits provide a bill of material of the components included in the kit. All items included in the kits are components that Versamatic recommends replacing when rebuilding a pump. The pump we are using today is an example of the ease of installation. Always consult your respective service and operating manual before performing any maintenance on your pump. Service and operating manuals include composite repair parts drawings, repair parts list, and torque specifications. For service and operating manuals and more information, visit us on the web at www.versamatic.com. Always remember that safety is the highest priority. When working on or around any equipment, always follow the correct safety procedures. Always read and follow the safety warnings and instructions in the service manual before any work is started on the pump. For more information, see the warm-up video on safety at Versamatic.com. The pump we are using in this presentation has been built new and is considerably easier to work with than a pump that has been used in a process. Additional time may be required in the preparation and separation of parts and components during the rebuild. Our airside rebuild will include the following: gasket, O-rings, U-cup seals, valve insert, and valve diverter. These are the recommended tools used with the rebuild. While the sizes may change based on the model, the type will remain the same. Torque wrench, ratchet, small slotted screwdriver, O-ring pick, snap ring pliers, sockets and or wrenches, 1/2 inch, 7/8 inch, 5/32 inch socket head Allen wrench. Alright, let's get started. Today we're going to use a 3/8 impact gun for ease of maintenance. We're going to remove the discharge manifold. Remove the discharge manifold and set aside. Once we have the discharge manifold removed, go ahead and remove the air valve assembly. Once the air valve assembly is removed, set aside for later rebuild. Remove the old valve insert, diverter, and air valve gasket and discard. Turn the pump upside down to give us a flat surface to work off of, and remove a suction manifold. Once the suction manifold is removed, set aside for later reassembly. Go ahead and remove the valve seat O-rings and valve seats. Remove the valve seats and the suction side check balls. Now remove one outer chamber. Once the outer chamber is removed, set aside for later reassembly. Leave one outer chamber on and remove the opposite diaphragm assembly. When removing this diaphragm assembly, you may get just the diaphragm assembly or diaphragm assembly to the rod. Once this is removed, set aside the inner and outer plates and diaphragm. Now remove the opposite outer chamber. Once this outer chamber is removed, set aside for later reassembly. Now remove the second diaphragm assembly, which is attached to the rod in this case. Set aside. Now we're ready to remove our main shaft retainer plate. Set aside the main shaft retainer plate and remove the main shaft O-ring. Be sure to discard the old main shaft O-ring. Now remove the pilot spool bumper O-ring so we can remove the pilot spool from the pilot sleeve. Once the pilot spool is removed, set aside. Remove the opposite main shaft retainer plate and set aside for later reassembly. Remove the old main shaft O-ring and discard. Now remove the pilot sleeve. Once the pilot sleeve is removed, set aside. Now we'll disassemble the main air valve assembly. Start by removing the end cap bolts. Once the end cap is removed, be sure to discard the end cap gasket. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now remove the air valve spool. Once we have our air valve spool removed, remove the U-cup seals from the spool and discard. Once the U-cup seals have been removed, be sure to inspect the air valve spool. Ensure there's no significant wear. You'll want to replace as needed. Now remove our pilot sleeve O-rings and discard also. Inspect the pilot sleeve for any damage and replace as needed. Now we remove the O-rings from our pilot spool. Discard all old O-rings and inspect the pilot spool for any wear, nicks, scratches, or damage and replace as needed. Now we're ready to install our complete airing kit. Go ahead and install the U-cup seals for the air valve spool. Ensure that the U-cup portion is facing inward.
Wow, that one went on pretty easy.
On the air valve spool. Make sure you fully install into the groove. Be sure to apply grease. Grease is applied to keep the items from catching, binding, or cutting while assembling components. Also be sure to apply grease to the main air valve body. When installing the air valve spool, be sure to compress the U-cup seals so they're not damaged when installing. Be sure that the main air valve spool moves freely within the air valve body. Now we're ready to install our end cap gaskets. Be sure to align porting for the bolt holes in the pilot hole on the gasket and the end cap. Be sure to also torque the end cap bolts to factory specification listed in the service manual. Repeat this process on the second side. Once we've installed our end caps, set the air valve assembly aside for later reassembly. Now we'll install the pilot sleeve O-rings. Begin to work from one end, installing the O-rings into the O-ring grooves on the pilot sleeve. Apply grease to the pilot sleeve O-rings to ensure do not bind, cut, or damage the pilot sleeve O-rings when installing the pilot sleeve into the center section of the pump. Also apply grease to the center section. Gently insert the pilot sleeve while turning so we don't roll, nick, or damage any of the O-rings during this process. Once the pilot sleeve is installed, now we'll install our main shaft O-ring. Be sure to apply grease to the main shaft O-ring to ensure this O-ring is not damaged when installing the diaphragm rod. Now install the shaft retainer plate. Go ahead and repeat this process for the second side. Now install the pilot spool O-rings, working from one end, leaving the bumper O-ring off. Again, you'll want to apply grease to the O-rings to ensure they don't catch, bind, or become cut. Install the pilot spool, turning and gently pressing in to the pilot sleeve to ensure we don't roll, nick, or damage any of the pilot spool O-rings. Once the pilot spool is fully inserted, install the bumper O-ring on the opposite side. Be sure that the bumper O-ring is fully seated into the O-ring groove. Now apply grease to the main shaft and the main shaft O-ring to ensure we don't catch, bind, or cut the main shaft O-ring when installing the diaphragm assembly. When installing the diaphragm assembly to the center section of the pump, be sure to align the bolt holes. Now we're ready to install our outer chamber. Inspect the outer chamber for casting integrity. Inspect the machine surfaces and radius of the chamber for damage or material buildup. Scarring, scratching, or material buildup can be cleaned up using emery paper, crocus cloth, or fine sandpaper. Chamber orientation requires the discharge side of the chamber to be installed in the same direction as the air valve face on the center block. Go ahead and begin installing the bolts for the outer chambers and torque in a cross pattern according to factory specifications. Torque specs are listed in the service manual. Now we're ready to install our opposite diaphragm assembly. Inspect your inner diaphragm plate, the radius. Ensure no sharp edges. You can address these sharp edges with emery cloth, crocus cloth, or sandpaper and replace as needed. Note the orientation of the diaphragm. States fluid side, you want the outer plate to go on the fluid side of the diaphragm and the radius of the inner plate towards the diaphragm. When you torque the opposite diaphragm assembly, if you achieve torque between bolt holes, as shown here, always go to the next hole. Never go backwards, as you may loosen the diaphragm assembly on either side. Now we're ready to install our outer chamber. Inspect the integrity of the outer chamber, the machine surfaces, the radius, the ball cage on the suction side. Note the orientation of the chamber with the center section of the pump. Align the bolt holes. And begin to install our bolts for our outer chamber. Torque the bolts in a cross pattern according to factory specifications listed in the service manual. Go ahead and turn the pump upside down. Install our suction check balls. Note the orientation of our valve seats. Inspect the ball seating area. Note that the O-ring groove will go towards the suction manifold. Now install our suction valve seat O-rings. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Begin to thread in the suction manifold bolts and tighten in a cross pattern. We want to inspect the manifold for scarring, damage, or material buildup. Check the casting for wear. Check the port for thread integrity. Repair or replace as needed. Install the discharge check balls. Inspect the valve seats. Inspect the O-ring groove and where the balls come to seat. Be sure that the O-ring groove is facing towards the water chamber. Now install our valve seat O-rings. Now we're ready to rebuild our air valve assembly. Install our valve diverter with the cut portion facing towards the ceramic valve insert. Note the orientation of the valve insert. Our air valve gasket, notes valve side goes towards the air valve body. Be sure to align with all bolt holes and piloting holes. Now install our air valve assembly. Be sure to align the bolt holes with the air valve assembly and not to block any porting holes. And torque the air valve bolts to factory specifications listed in the service manual. Now we're ready to install our discharge manifold. Go ahead and thread the bolts in place. Be sure to thread in the bolts prior to tightening and tighten the bolts in a cross pattern. This concludes our airside repair video for an E1 poly with a metal center pump. When doing a complete rebuild, also see our wet side video. For additional information, find us on the web at Versamatic.com or contact after sales support at service.versamatic@idexcorp.com. Thank you.